Welcome, friends, as we gather for our starting presentation for the fall of our Christian Formation Sunday Forums at St. Paul's. My name is Javier. Once again, I'm the Associate Rector at St. Paul's, and it's my pleasure to welcome Philip and Kristen, both licensed therapists who are here to talk to us about anxiety and stress in the middle of a pandemic. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. Thank you for having us. We're really grateful to be able to be here. I'm Kristen Mastro. I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor. Philip, you can introduce yourself and we'll get started.
Yeah, same, Philip, licensed clinical mental health counselor here in the area. And also a member of St. Luke's, and so happy to be joining with St. Paul's today. And I will say, Chris and I are both used to presenting. I am more of a, let me walk around the room and talk to people. So this is a strange new world. That's kind of what we're talking about anyway. So you will hear some of that in our talk today. So Kristen's going to start us off, and I'm going to hand it back to you, Kristen.
Great. We're ready to move on to the first slide, and we'll talk about anxiety. So anxiety 101, what is anxiety? When we talk about anxiety in our work, we really talk about our brain versus our body and how we experience it in those two areas. We have physical and cognitive responses to stress, and that can manifest in many different ways. But I want to pinpoint the difference between fear and anxiety. So fear is in the here and now. Fear is an immediate danger that's right in front of us. Like you're hiking in the woods and you turn around a corner and there's a bear there. That is an immediate danger, and our body goes into fight, flight, freeze mode to take care of that. Anxiety is anticipatory. So it's about something in the future that we might be worried about. And everybody has worries. Everybody has worries about all different kinds of things. And part of the talk we're going to do today is how to tell the difference between an everyday worry and something that is actually an anxiety or a diagnosable anxiety disorder. So everyday worries are not excessive, and they're perceived as manageable, and you can often kind of put them to the side when other pressing things come to the forefront. Anxiety, or a diagnosable anxiety disorder, is an excessive worry that's out of proportion to the likelihood of an event happening. Anxiety disorders tend to be more pervasive and pronounced in their distress. They frequently recur without a trigger or a perceived trigger. A lot of times we'll hear people like, all of a sudden I was just freaking out and I don't know why. And they're more likely to be accompanied by physical symptoms. So some physical manifestations in your body of anxiety can be muscle tension, headaches, stomach upset, restlessness, like a feeling like you have to move all the time, increased heart rate, increased breathing or shallow breathing, sweating, shaking, that kind of thing, which often people associate with heart attacks, which is why a lot of people who have a panic attack or an anxiety attack end up in the emergency room because they're thinking they're having a heart attack. Anxiety in the brain, what we think often or what we're experiencing cognitively are racing thoughts, a lot of what if, well, if this happens, what am I going to do? If this happens, what am I going to do? Not being able to focus and settle, or a hyper focus on one particular thing. A lot of rumination, like focusing on one thing over and over and over to try and figure out like how to solve a problem. Oftentimes people report sometimes their mind going blank and really not being able to think about anything. And then often we see like sleep disruption as well, like either sleeping too much or not being able to sleep at all. So why does all this happen, right? So there's biological reason for this. I mentioned earlier the fight, flight, freeze response. That is an important part of how our brain works to keep us safe. So if you imagine, I'm going to use my hand to kind of demonstrate. if this is your brain, this is your neck, this goes down into your body, right? So this is your brain stem coming up. When we get stimulus from our environment, it comes in, it kind of travels up into the lower part of our brain right here. This is the part of our brain that is the fight, flight, freeze. And it sorts all of our input into safe or not safe. So if it's not safe, it's going to trigger then something like, okay, we need to do something about this. And that goes into the emotional part of our brain right here, where we might have a fear response or a worry response to something that we're perceiving as potentially dangerous. And if that is processed in a way, in an emotional way, this is, yes, this is scary and I need to do something about this. I call it, we flip our lid. So our prefrontal cortex, which is this part right here, is the part of our logical thinking that goes offline. And you can't logic, you can't reason, you can't think through anything other than just trying to keep yourself safe. So there are two ways the anxiety travels, right? It travels up through the body into our brain, and then our brain down into our body to tell us what to do. So today we're going to be discussing more about anxiety. And I see the comments. We're about to move on to the next slide. So I'm ready for that. If we can move on. Thank you. Okay, so anxiety in children and teens are a little bit different than in adults. I work with both children and teens as well as adults in therapy. So symptoms that can be present, some of the ones that we went over but earlier, but irritability and defiance are often something that parents see in their children. And that can come across as kids being really difficult, like they don't want to cooperate, they don't want to sit down and do their homework, they don't want to engage, they get angry really easily. Typically, children's anxiety tends to be focused more on their competence level or the quality of their performance. They're really worried about how they do something. With COVID and with our current pandemic, they're tending to, I'm seeing a lot of children who are tending to be more worried about safety and the health of others. They can also be worried about themselves, but they tend to be worried about others around them. Children also often really present with anxiety in a somatic way. I have a lot of people that come to therapy after already having been to their pediatrician, to the doctor, because they're having stomach aches or they're having pain. It's kind of like they can't find any medical reason for it. So the doctor's like, hey, I think you need to get this evaluated by a mental health professional. And part of the reason that children struggle with this and can't communicate, right? They don't have adult brains, first of all. And they also have very little control over their worlds. We, as adults, kind of tell them what to do, when to do, how to do. They don't have a lot of options. They're told when to eat, when to sleep, when to go to school, what to study, when they can play, when they can't. And that's appropriate. They're children. They don't have adult brains. But that can also lead to a feeling of like not having control, and that can produce anxiety. When we're anxious as adults, kids get anxious too. They're really good at picking up on anxiety in their elders and especially their caregivers. And the reason that is because kids rely on adults to keep them safe. So if the adults are worried and freaked out, then the kids really think there's something to be worried about. So it kind of feeds off of it. So part of the work that I do with children and parents is like, okay, if you're anxious, your kid's going to be anxious too. So we need to work on your anxiety as well. When kids are in that heightened state, when their lid has flipped and their prefrontal cortex is offline, you're not going to be able to logic with them. You're not going to be able to reason with them. They literally can't hear you because that part of their brain is offline. I like to kind of help children gauge with a number scale on what their anxiety level is between 1 and 10. With 10 is like, you can see, like, they aren't going to be able to tell you that it's a 10 because you're going to be able to see it. They're just kind of totally freaked out. Anything above a 4 or 5, they're starting to get to this point where this is going offline. So they can't hear you. And in those moments, then the important thing is just to comfort them, be close, be present, and eventually they will regulate off of your calmness. And on the next slide, we're going to talk about anxiety in adults and how that's a little bit different. So feeling nervous or tense, sometimes there's a sense of impending danger or doom, also irritability, but it doesn't look quite the same as it does with kids, not being able to concentrate. And then a lot of times, as opposed to flight of different things, we're really focusing on life circumstances that we're worried about, like life, our kids, our health. As adults, we often have physical symptoms, but we find ways to dismiss them or ignore them. So part of the work that we can do in managing our anxiety is paying attention to what our body tells us. As adults, we try and fix anxiety by problem solving, but you can't plan your way out of anxiety, because remember, this part, the thinking part, the logical part, is kind of offline when anxiety is flaring. And anxiety, I call anxiety brain, that part of our brain that helps us worry, can give you a false sense of security and thinking, like, if I plan for everything, then I'll be able to figure this out and I'll feel better. But inevitably, of course, the one thing you don't plan for is the thing that happens, and that sets anxiety off all over again. I equate that anxiety brain, that part that's talking to us in our head about all the things that we're worried about, is a loud, screaming bully that lies and does all it can do to stay in charge and keep you in that anxious state. So right now, if you're a person who's worried about the pandemic and worried about COVID, that your anxiety brain might be telling you the world is not safe because of COVID. I have to do something to protect myself and my family. So I'm going to do these things. And we have rituals and we have steps and we have all these things we're going to plan. I'm going to go to the store and I'm going to wear the mask, but I'm going to do the hand sanitizer as soon as I get out. And if somebody comes close to me, what am I going to do? That type of planning. What we are seeing different ways of coping with COVID. This is cognitive coping. So we have people who are locking things down and trying to control everything. And then the opposite side of the spectrum, which is a complete denial of the problem and pretending as everything is normal, and then everything in between. On our next slide, talking about COVID-19 anxiety behaviors that adults are often reporting. So vivid dreams, irregular sleep patterns, hoarding, again, irritability, and intolerance for other people's perspectives, and clinginess or withdrawal from others. Like we're either withdrawing from people or we're feeling like we need to be close to somebody all the time. So why are we doing these? It's because our brain is trying to process all this information, and it's been in kind of a state of shock in the last several months with all the changes, and it changes rapidly. It's sometimes hard to know what to pay attention to and how to take steps to make ourselves safe. When we're talking about the spectrum of like locking everything down versus pretending like nothing is happening, anger and frustration can happen on both sides. So the question I ask people is like, are you more likely to get angry if you go to the store and you saw people wearing masks, or if you go to the store and see people not wearing masks? That can make people really angry. And I'm sure if you've been at all aware on social media or the news, seeing incidents of confrontations that are happening in public with people who are either wearing or not wearing masks. And how do we work with that? How do we fix that? So the answer lies in trying to balance and having a reasonable perspective about what we can reasonably do to keep ourselves safe without kind of falling apart and panicking, but also not ignoring the problem. And at this point, we're going to talk about attachment. I'm going to turn it over to Philip.
Yeah, so we can have the next slide, please. So when we talk about attachment, we're talking about kind of the root of where some of this anxiety that we're experiencing due to COVID originates. In September 1st of 1939, the British government began sending 1.5 million people, 800,000 of them were children. In 3 days span, were moved out of the cities into the countryside to people they may know and people they may not know. And so John Bowlby decided, I wonder what effect this has on the children's attachment to their parents and to other people. And so we've been studying human attachment since 1939. And out of that, we've come to realize lots of really important information about what community looks like. And community being parent to child, community being a family unit, community being a church setting. But we've learned a lot about what it means to be attached to other humans, in a healthy way. And one of the things that we've learned from this is that all of us are born with one belief, that we are good, that the world is good, and that other people are good. And I put up a couple of references there that y'all may recognize for why we believe that also in our theological understanding. We have the psychological understanding too. And there are plenty of studies that show this, because we know that babies are born with 4 basic needs. They are born with the need to be touched, the need to be fed, which I think in adulthood we would call that more nourished, the need to be protected, and the need to be loved. And we attach that to this belief system because babies are born with the belief that people are good and going to meet their needs. And it's only when these needs are challenged, when we experience trauma, that belief system begins to change and that our basic human attachments begin to get disrupted. And so what we're seeing in COVID is really a lot of ways in which our basic human need for community and our human need for being touched, for being fed, for being protected, and to be loved are being challenged right now. I also added at the bottom, just because this is a parish setting, that this is another definition of understanding human connection as the body of Christ. This idea of this is what we are responsible for one another. And some of the challenges we're seeing in our church settings right now is that we are distanced from one another and we can't do these things. So we're seeing a special anxiety in lots of folks who are very active in a church community. And if I can get to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about why this is happening. Since March, really when COVID, became present and every day, and we all came home and shut down for a period of time. Some of us still are. We're in, like Kristen said, we're in varying stages of what we're doing with it. But we immediately had this worry about our health and safety. Are we being protected? Are our loved ones being protected? We've heard this as Kristen said, in social media and in the news. Is our government protecting us? Are other people protecting us that when we go out and get the food we need, right? There were periods of time early on in COVID in which we were worried about food supply, toilet paper supply, right? Are my basic needs to be fed and nourished going to be met? We have worries about income. If we have jobs that require us to be in the public area, are those businesses still open? Are we allowed to do telehealth to continue to do the work we do? We had this worry in March through June, and it's back again. We're worried about school. Are our children getting an education that they need? Are they able to focus? For many of us who do this work, we also know that screen time amplifies anxiety in kids, and we're putting them in front of a screen for hours a day to try to learn while we're also increasing their anxiety. So there's that worry as well. So lots of ways that need to be touched, to be fed and nourished, to be protected and to be loved. All 4 of those are being challenged across the board when it comes to COVID and what this pandemic has done to us as a society and individuals and families. And basically, like I said, our basic needs are being threatened, and we don't know when this will end. So this is having a profound impact on a continual anxiety. As Kristen said, we are in a constant state of flipping our frontal lobe, right? We're flipping our lid daily with worry when we get in the car, when we use hand sanitizer, when we wear a mask. Do we open our front door? Do we go to work? Think about all those questions that we have running through our heads. We're constantly doing this. And we've been doing this for months. In the next slide, I will talk about grief briefly, because we can't really understand some of the anxiety we're experiencing without this idea of grief. And we typically think of grief as a moment in time. We lose a loved one, we lose a job, something else happens, and it's this moment we can point to. And we know when it started, and all the grief never ends. We talk about grief orbiting. There's that moment in time, and we orbit around it the rest of our lives. And in that orbit, we may be really close to center when it's originally happened, but it gets larger over time. And we have more room for life to fill in that space. And that is the natural progression of grief. And in that time, we may be angry, we may have denial, we may be hungry, or we may not be able to eat. We may want people around and suddenly want to be by ourselves. If you've experienced grief, you understand what I'm talking about. The complicated part of this pandemic is we had a start point, but we don't know when the ending's coming. Instead of having a moment in time in which we can say, that's it, that's what I'm dealing with, that's what I'm trying to process and understand, we're in a constant state of tight orbit. We haven't had a lot of space yet for life to come back in and fill in that space around the grief. And we're experiencing this with the loss of school for some people. Folks who can't experience their senior year, can't experience their first year of kindergarten in the way that tradition tells us that we would do those things. People who, like I said, have experienced the loss of work and income and security that would bring. And experiencing the loss of time with others. You know, that we may be able to see our family, but some of us still aren't doing it in the house. We might do it across the yard. We may not hug our parents, but we will do a social distance visit with them, right? That sense of touch, someone to touch me who loves me, someone to nourish me. There's some grief in that space that we're all still experiencing. Oh, the next one. So what do we do about all this? We've acknowledged that it's here. We all know it. We all feel it. What do we do? Well, we talk about the balancing of nurture, play, and structure in our lives. And I will briefly go through what these mean and why this is important. But these are really about learning to feel safe in the world again, but it's also about reclaiming balance and addressing some of those attachment issues that lead to our heightened anxiety. So you see the picture of the stool. We talk about nurture, play, and structure, the three legs of a stool that we're standing on in life. And the idea is we want to balance that stool as much as we can. And of course, when things happen, we have a bad day, get in an argument with someone, or we have a great day, the stool wobbles a little bit. And right now, the stool is wobbling a lot because of that extended anxiety, that extended grief. And so what we're trying to do with nurture, play, structure is balance this as much as we can. And the next slide is about what do we mean by nurture, to give you some understanding. The quotes above are from, on the slide, sorry, are from Dean Ornish in a book called Love and Survival, in which they look at the health benefits of folks who experience community and places where there's an experience of attachment. I won't go into all the details, but he talks about one community, really close community, I believe in Pennsylvania, an immigrant community who held on to tradition and fed one another and had intergenerational connections and monitored their health rates for a period of time. And then as the community became more integrated, more less attachment, more individualism, more leaving of the community to go other places where if for generations they would have stayed, we start to see health disparities rise and the numbers of health issues increase in that community. And so he talks about the need to feel loved and to feel connected and to feel attached to community. So when we talk about nurture, play, structure, we're talking about who we are as people and what we need to be ourselves. So nurture is really about being celebrated, being accepted for who you are, whether someone agrees with you or disagrees with you, that you know that they are going to nurture you in a way that provides touch and love and nourishment and protection because you're appreciated for who you are. So it's really about what we need to receive emotionally to be our full selves in the world. That's what we mean by nurture. And simply stated, that is love. But it's a love, like I said, that makes you feel safe to be yourself. That's that protection part. The challenge for most of us is that this kind of nurture, this true nurture, requires the ultimate vulnerability because we have to say who we are and what we need to be ourselves. We have to say that thing we're most afraid someone will not give us in order to receive it. And we have to name it out loud. But that's the idea of what nurture feels like when we get it. The other idea to understand nurture is this idea of delighting in the delight of another, and that someone delights in you just for the pure joy of seeing your happiness. Give an example. I do not like Pokemon. I don't understand Pokemon. Just tried, don't get it. My 7-year-old loves it. right? And so for me, the idea of nurturing him is to get in the car and drive around on Saturdays to do Pokestops, or to sit in the floor and draw Pokemon characters, or play the game as he makes up the rules as he wants to win, because I delight in watching him having fun. And that's an example for me of parenting where I can give some of that nurture. And we all need to receive it in that way too. Someone who appreciates something we do just for the sheer joy of our appreciation. That's nurture. The next slide is on play and understanding what play is when we talk about play. We often think, oh, kids need time to play. Of course, let's send them outside. Let's go to PE. Let's do sports, what have you. And somewhere about our middle school years, we begin to say, you can't play anymore. The play has lost its purpose, and that's something kids do. Although we kind of put it into categories and we gender it and put it into sports or other places, we're still there, but we've put lots of rules around it. And we actually lose the meaning of what play is in our lives. Play is where we gain the energy to be alive. It's where we have things to look forward to, or things to look back on fondly, so that we don't just kind of flatline through life and get through day by day, which some of you may recognize in COVID land, of doing the same thing every day, right? But play are these peaks of joy. They can be vacations, they can be reunions, they can be, when we can, dinners out with friends, right? But things we look forward to, or things that we look back on and say, oh, that was so good. And we know play because it releases what we call the happy hormones, right? Those chemical reactions in our body that we need to be healthy. They're associated with lower rates of disease, lower rates of cancer, of heart disease, right? Because our body needs them. And again, so part of the balance in our life is regaining a sense of play. Play for play's sake, and I'll go through that in a bit. The other interesting thing about play and community, we are in a world right now that is very divided. We're very divided by, like Kristen said, our anxieties. Do we wear a mask or not? Who's going to win an election? Can I still be in a relationship with this person who disagrees with how I'm going to vote? And can I have dinner with this person who hasn't been socially distancing the way I have? Lots of these things. The beauty of play is that studies show us that play remaps trust in our brain. So when we play together, we begin to trust each other. So about a third to half of the sessions I have each week are with couples, often couples in distress. And kind of the things that most couples will try is, well, let's do a date night. And those are important, don't get me wrong. Those are very important. Let's do a date night. Let's try to be serious and remember that we love each other. It's not gonna work. But if we can get a couple to play and be silly and belly laugh together, we will see drastic improvement in their relationship, because they're remapping trust with one another, just as kids do with their friend circles they're developing in younger age. And because play is about energy, and play is about being excited to be alive, it restores our belief in the world's goodness. It rebuilds that original place of I'm good, you're good, and the world is good. Because when we can truly connect with someone through play, we get a glimpse of their goodness. And that's why it's important now. I'm gonna jump ahead a bit because we're gonna talk about what do you do at the end, but some of my play is important right now. The ideas of vacations, of pillow forts in our living rooms if we're not going out in public, of movie nights and popcorn, of anything we can do to find moments of play, to bring our anxiety down in the everyday experience of repeated COVID anxiety is really important. So the next slide, let me give you a bit more about what we know play is, because we all have ideas. We think it may be sports, or it may be an art, a craft, a video game, you name it, but true play doesn't have a purpose. It is done for the sake of playing. It's voluntary. No one's told you to do it. You just want to enjoy yourself. It has inherent attraction. It's fun and it makes you feel good. It allows a freedom from time. So we lose a sense of time. We often, well, when people are truly playing, we'll say, gosh, we need to wrap up. And like, this is in therapy, actually. I'll play with clients sometimes in the office. And they'll say, oh, we're at time. Like, no, we just got started. It's only been 5 minutes. Like, well, it's been 55. Right? Play loses a sense of where you are. Diminished consciousness of self is part of that too. We don't usually care how people perceive us when we're happy. So play is important to, again, getting to that place where I can say, this is where I really am. So then I can name what I need in the world with nurture. It's unstructured, it's unplanned, and it's experiential. It's just done for its own sake. And we don't want it to end. Most of us can remember when we were kids, hopefully, there were times at which we were outside playing perhaps, and our parents said, come in, it's time for dinner. And we did oh, come on, 5 more minutes. Just let me, come on, 5 more minutes. Because play was so important that we didn't want it to end. And we still need that sense of, think about your last day of vacation. You're like, come on, stretch this out. I don't want this to end. That's what play is like. Where we're seeing this often in adults, though, now, and we're hearing, well, I own it myself too, maybe staying up a little too late watching Netflix. Maybe, being busy during my day, but then I find myself up at 1 or 2 a.m. still reading something I'm really into or watching a show. Our bodies know we need play. And if we're not intentional about it, our subconscious is going to make it happen. So recognize where that may be happening for each of you, and then we'll look at how do we incorporate that into the everyday in a healthy way to avoid some of the anxiety it can cause when we feel guilty because we've been up till 2 a.m. and we've got an 8 a.m. meeting. And our next slide is about structure. In its true form, in its healthiest form, structure is just how we communicate who we are to the world. It's how we make sense of the world around us, and it's how we navigate our relationships. So at its core, structure is how we communicate what we need when we talk about nurture and what we want from play to others. And that could be when we say yes or when we say no. That could be our boundaries. For some of us in this time of COVID, that is, I'm going to stay home more. I'm not going to participate in the things that my friends and neighbors are doing. I can still wish them well. Right? And for others, it may be, I'm going to make those invitations anyway because I want you to know I am more comfortable and I want you to come with me if you're open to it. Right? Those rules that we have for navigating life, our checklist, right? That's part of telling the world who we are. Here are the things that are important to me to get done today. Right? That's what structure is really about. And it's another way of understanding structure. It is the language by which we understand our emotions. So for me, I am a highly structured person. I love a checklist. Because when I get to say, I got that done, that sense of accomplishment is a rush, right? That is what structure helps me with navigating my emotions, right? Interpersonally, rules of engagement in couples, right? There are certain things that, have to go unspoken in my relationship with my husband. And I know what they mean because we have a structure in place over time that we know this is how we communicate love, whether we say it out loud or not. And what we've lost in COVID, really quickly, one of the reasons we're feeling anxiety with the loss of structure, we know that there were routines and things we had in place pre-COVID, right? Maybe goals we had set. And this year we're going to go on vacation. I was 2 weeks from Disney and COVID hit. Did not get to go. Structure was thrown out the window. But what most of us are missing, and it took a while really for us in the field even to see how this was having an emotional impact, are the unspoken structures. Maybe the barista you said good morning to at the drive-thru at Starbucks. Maybe the cashier at the grocery store that you would see every week and have a conversation with. Right? NPR, listening to NPR on the drive-in to the office. Right? For me, a big one, I had a habit of getting in and driving from Durham to Raleigh, and I would pass St. Luke's, my parish, and I would get my Anglican rosary out, and I would pray the rosary the rest of the way to Raleigh. It was a couple of months into COVID when I realized I was in an irritable mood at the same time every morning because I'd lost that routine. And I had lost those signaling reminders of I'm driving by my parish, grab the rosary and let's pray, right? So many ways that just life was thrown out of whack, and those things that we had put in place subconsciously without realizing they were our structure were taken away from us. And so we saw an increase in anxiety there too. Kristen, I think you're going to talk about when these are out of balance.
Sure. So our next slide talks about when nurture, play, and structure are out of balance, and kind of drilling down to each individual leg of the stool. So without nurture, we are more prone to depression and anxiety because we don't feel safe emotionally. It can trigger biological anxiety. Nurture brings us a sense of safety. We know we are loved. And if that is absent, then we're going to be anxious about that. Play. Without play, life is dull. We don't have those, what Philip described as those peaks of that joy, the break from this, right? So that can lead to depression. And if we have too much play, if all we're doing is up here, then we're avoiding the nurture part and the structure part too. Without structure, life can seem aimless. Without direction, that can lead to anxiety. Nurture is left unattended, and we can become anxious because we're trying to figure out how to get that structure back in place. We're confused, and we're looking like, hey, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? When really what we need to do is go back to our nurture needs. And the next slide is going to talk about some of the things that we do that are not helpful in trying to get that balance. And Philip's going to talk about that.
Yeah, so one of the things that we like to talk about is that those attachments needs, those 4 basic nurture needs, and all the others that we kind of nuance as we grow in age, are always going to be met 100% of the time. We were formed with those needs. God put those needs into our bodies. God put our emotions into our bodies. And so we have in our society, and sometimes in the church even, a way of saying these are good emotions: pride in a healthy way, joy, happiness, love. And these are bad emotions: envy, jealousy, lust, you name it. The truth is, God gave us all the emotions. So we believe that all emotions either celebrate a need that has been met or direct us to a need left unmet. So those emotions we consider bad often are just signaling that there's some need that hasn't been met and needs to be addressed. And so I'm going to use the terms destructive and productive, and I want to be careful that I'm not talking about judging someone's behavior. You're talking about, are they destructive or productive towards the goals this person has for their life? So what we have seen over time is that, like I said, all of those needs are going to be met. We're going to find time for play. And if I have an 8 a.m. meeting and I need to get up at 5 and I'm still up at 3 o'clock watching Netflix, that may be destructive, even though play in and of itself is important to who I am as a person because it's what I need for my body, right? I will tell you, theologically, I don't believe there is any sin that has not originated from an unmet need, I can say that, right? That all those subconscious drivers and impulses are just trying to get either touch, love, protection, or nourishment. And if I don't name what I need nurture-wise or try to achieve what I want for play and joy, my subconscious and my body is going to do it for me. And so then those things become destructive to who I really want to be as a person. And one of the things we see then is that leads very quickly to the shame cycle. And the more we get into that shame cycle of I failed, I'm not good enough, then the less likely we are to ask for our needs to be met. And the more likely we are to be anxious and depressed. So again, when we can get to a place of finding balance and really naming what it is we need from others with an expectation that they're going to meet those needs because they're good, because God said so, then we're more likely to experience less anxiety and less depression and be more in balance. One other thing to be careful of with the destructive reactions is we all are more likely to fall into one of the 3 legs of the stool. Some people fall more in play. They think in their gut. They go with the emotion. I live in my head, so I have more anxiety, and I am super structured. So when I get distressed, when I get anxious, I will often lean back into that leg of the stool and put more things on my to-do list when I'm already overworked, because it will feel good for me to feel productive. So much so that when we are in the office, there are many times I've walked into Kristen's office at like 7 a.m. and said, hey, I had this new idea, we need to do this thing, and I'll rattle off and she'll let me go with it, and then she'll say, what's your anxiety so high about? Because she knows if I'm getting really, really super scheduled, that's a clear sign that my anxiety is high, right? And that's also knowing someone well enough and being attached and knowing each other for over a decade now, that we can recognize those things in each other, right? That is part of healthy attachment that we have developed in our friendship. So Kristen, you're going to talk about the children's needs, right?
Yes. So our next slide, how to determine what your child needs. So is your child anxious? Remember we talked earlier about the difference between worry and anxiety. Worry can be kind of pushed aside. Anxiety is more disruptive and pervasive. When children are anxious, a lot of times we see them act out because they're seeking nurture and reassurance from the adults in their lives. Children will often take negative attention in order to experience attachment and nurture, even if it involves punishment. So we want to pay attention to that. Remember, kids do not have adult brains. They will not have fully developed brains until they're 25. So expecting a 7-year-old or 12-year-old to think like we do is not a realistic expectation. They can't reason the way we reason. They do not have that biological capacity. So we need to pay attention to that as well. The most important thing we can do, of course, is validate their feelings and sharing age-appropriate information with them about what our world is like. And remember earlier we talked about, is your anxiety fueling your child's anxiety? Because if we're anxious, our kids are going to be anxious. They pick up on it and they don't even realize they're picking up on it. So if their worries are disruptive, if they're defiant, if they're having trouble eating or sleeping and you're anxious too, then I would say a professional intervention would be probably helpful for the family. And on the next slide talks about anxiety tools for you, which Philip is going to go over.
Yeah, and I want to real quick add to something Kristen said. So as a parent of a child with anxiety in COVID times, right, it is a parenting thing to go to the behavior. And I think Kristen said this earlier. I just want to attach this to the idea of destructive reactions. To go to, my child is misbehaving, my child is doing something, I need to correct their behavior. But if we begin to recognize that destructive reaction, they're acting out, they're tantruming, they're not wanting to go to bed, whatever it is, and then look to, do they need to be held right now? Do they need some nourishment? Do they need protection? Or do they just need to know they're loved? We can generally address that behavior quicker and in healthier ways by naming one of those four and providing it, as opposed to simply addressing the behavior. And some of the same for us as adults. Let's talk about what it is for adults, right? Self-care. We live in a very structured society. Different lectures sometime on how our school system teach us to value external structure over internal. But one of the things it leaves us with is feeling that self-care is selfish. We hear this over and over again when people come in to see us. I can't take time to meditate. I can't take time to go to the gym. I don't have time to just go do something for myself because I have all these other responsibilities, as if it feels selfish. And so we do a lot of work in reminding folks, self-care is part of loving yourself, right? It's one of those four basic needs you have. It's one of the greatest, part of the greatest commandment, right? Part 3 of the greatest commandment, and is to love yourself. And until we start to explore, what would that look like? And I think all of us during this time of COVID and feeling that sense of loss of play feels restricted, nurture feels restricted right now, finding some ways to figure out what self-care looks like in this time is really important. We said this earlier, but play, finding ways to play. I said my 7-year-old does Pokemon, I didn't enjoy it. He also has a Switch and I enjoy it. So I have found in the time of COVID that at 46-year-old, I suddenly like video games. So who knew that, right? But it has allowed the sense of play to come back into my life because all the rules were thrown out. And it's COVID time, so why not? And I have found moments of escapism there that have been really good, healthy escapism. The other is to be present in time and space. As Kristen said at the beginning, you know, fear is right here and now. Anxiety is in the future. So one of the things that's really important is to remind ourselves where we are, right? In our conversation in our house is, how are we doing Halloween? How are we going to do Christmas? What's it going to look like? And then we have to pull back from that space. We can visit it, but then we pull back and remind ourselves, we're not there yet. Right now we need to figure out what school's going to look like on Monday, right? And start getting ready for this coming week. We need to do that as much as we can. Some of the ways we do that, breathing, mindfulness, if there are times in which if we're really high, like Kristen said on that scale, if we're at a 5 or 6 and we can still do it, look at everything in your room and name it out loud, especially if you have a bookshelf. Usually by the third, reading the titles of the books, by the third shelf, you're going to be right back in your body, because you can't do that exercise and be somewhere else in time at the same time. Flexibility is key right now. Right? This is hard on people like me who are super structured and like our rules and like our schedules, but we got to be flexible. The world is not following a routine and pattern as it always has. And I'll talk about in a minute, we're probably not going back to it. So we've got to figure out ways we can adapt. And we really do think balancing nurture, play, and structure is one of the ways we do that. So then we can be productive in our actions, even if they're uncomfortable and new, instead of destructive because we're fighting to get back somewhere we can't get back to. The other is to name your needs, and for yourself, in whichever community you find yourself, name what it is you need. And as Kristen said with the previous slide, know when to ask for help professionally. These are uncharted times for everyone, and we all need an extra bit of help right now to get through this. And the question that we both have been asking a lot of people to kind of start navigating what self-care looks like now, what the future may look like in a healthy, productive model of thinking about it and not an anxious model of thinking about it, and some of the grief work. What do I miss that I want back when COVID is over? What do I never want to pick back up again when COVID is over? And what have I gained since March that I don't want to give up? And for a lot of people, that looks like, I found video games, or I don't want to go back to an office setting, or I am so happy I get to spend a year with my family, right? Or I can't wait to get back to school. I can't wait to get back to an office, right? But we need to honor those things so we can actually name what we need and be true to ourselves to meet those attachment needs, to decrease our anxiety and to process our grief. And the next slide, we just have a few resources for folks to, if they're interested. You know, the National Alliance on Mental Illness is a great resource. And if you're not familiar with that, always it's a go-to to check out good information. Also, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has great information right now, especially in regards to COVID. And our own diocese has a really good website of resources for COVID. And others, we just put up some books that we typically use. These are all, and I put this in quotes, children's books. I use them with adult anxiety groups all the time. These are amazing books to read for ourselves, to read in community, that talk about nurture, how the rabbit listened, how to just be present with someone and provide those 4 things that we talked about. The invisible web, about how we're all connected, and it's all about attachment and feeling that pull from one another. Kristen, you know the next one. I'll let you.
Yeah, You Are Special is about expectations of performance in relation to others' expectations and our own. So kind of realistically evaluating what our purpose is and how we can be content with ourselves.
Yeah, and thank you, Kristen. And No Such Thing as a Dragon is a great book for kind of exploring what happens when we ignore a problem exists. We see some of this in our greater society right now, as Kristen said, and it's an anxious response people are having. But basically, the story of a kid who sees a dragon, no one else sees it, and the more they ignore it, the bigger it gets until it kind of runs away with the house. And then once it's named and it's talked about, everything goes back to being good. So again, those unmet nurture needs continue to grow and amplify, and our anxiety will continue to increase until we get those needs met. And Kristen, The Wizard's Wish, you have more experience with. I'll let you.
Sure. Yeah, The Wizard's Wish is a book that talks about, uses the emotional freedom technique, which is a tapping on acupressure points on your body to kind of help regulate. So it's a great book for people to be able to, for kids especially, but also for adults, that gives you strategies for bringing anxiety down, which is really nice.
Yeah. And then next slide is just a couple of other things. If folks want more information, there is a website for Nurture, Play, Structure where you can get a little bit more information than we presented today. And then if you have questions for us later, it's easiest to find us at Riverstone Wellness, and feel free to reach out to either one of us. We're happy to answer questions anytime in the future. And thank you. That's the next slide in our references, but last slide, thank you. And now what questions do people have?
Thank you both. All right, I'm gonna leave the slide up for just a bit for people to take down the information just as they need it. But I do have one question that came up in the Q&A. First of all, it says great session. Thank you so much for your time. Any comment on escapist behaviors in teenagers?
Lots.
Go ahead, Philip.
You go ahead. You go first.
Okay. So what I'm seeing a lot now, and I have 2 teenagers myself, high school age kids, and they're really struggling with this. They are missing their friends. They're missing even though they probably wouldn't admit this, the structure that school provides for them, and the difference in online stuff. And I'm seeing a lot of, not in just in my own children, but in the children that I work with, of wanting to watch more content and play more video games, and try and find ways to just ignore everything that's kind of going on around them, which can be, I think the question is probably about like how much is too much. And yes, it can be too much because we're avoiding. Like I have one of my children is a senior in high school this year, and we had a very difficult conversation yesterday about how she is trying to figure out how to apply for college and how to do that. And she has spent the entire summer up until now avoiding having to work on her college stuff because she is so worried about how that process is going to work. She doesn't have her normal resources. She's escaped into doing other things. So as parents, some of the job that we have is to kind of bring that back to reality a little bit. Okay, so this isn't going away, and we need to maybe reevaluate what our goals are, and bring some of that structure back in place so that we can gently guide them towards being less in escape world and a little bit more in what's in front of us too. Philip, if you have anything else.
Yeah, that I think is the most common, is that escapism of Netflix or procrastination, but also want to recognize the escapism of overproduction. So for a lot of teens, especially if they're super structured, are more focused on, I have to get 100, I have to get everything done. They're taking on more work, like I was talking about, I would do, right? Or still do. We've seen that some of that in teens as well, right? That because when the world feels uncontrollable, I can control my production. I can control my grades. And so some of these kids are struggling with not sleeping, but not sleeping because they're playing video games or something, but not sleeping because they're working on a project who isn't due for, I actually have a client who has a project due at the end of this year. So June-ish, and they are up most nights of the week working on it already, because that is where they can put their energy. So I'm doing a lot of work with that client on how are we playing, or how are we socializing, what are we doing with the family? So trying everything I can to get away from that sense of perfectionism as escapism and finding more balance.
Thank you both. Again, it's 11:16, so I want to keep it open maybe for another 5-10 minutes. If there are more questions, you can raise your hand, or you can ask questions through the Q&A. If you raise your hand, I can unmute you, and you can just talk and ask the question as well. So let me know. But as we take an extra 5 to 10 minutes, I had a question. So I love the way you described staying up late watching Netflix as something that was rooted in our need for play. I had never thought about it that way. I had just gone directly into shame and thought, why am I wasting my time this way? And I was thinking about the diminished consciousness of self. And so I'm just curious in the patterns among adults. I mean, I'm looking at myself here, like how do we structure play more in such a way that these patterns don't become unhealthy? And again, very concerned about my own Netflix habits.
I'll take this one first, Kristen, and then you go after me. I think, it's interesting, right? The way that you phrase that question, how do we structure play? It's not structured. Right? But that goes to such of our Western formation.
Yeah.
Right? That it play after middle school, play has to be productive. And I think what we do mostly with boys, but girls somewhat, we gender this and say, you're not allowed to play unless you can score a goal. Right? And you think about what sports are often for boys. There's touch, there's protection, there's nourishment and feeding one another, encouraging one another, right? There's that sense of competition as well. So a lot of that attachment that we get in play for boys after middle school gets moved into sports. And this is the one area you can have it. If not, it has to be productive somehow in a different way. The idea of play is finding things in your life that are totally unexpected, if I can say that, right? Like I said, 46, and who knew I would get into Animal Crossing and Mario Brothers, right? But that's the sense of play. And there are times in which we need to make time for it and structure it in our schedules that way, right? But making sure that it's not about being productive. And so a lot of it is if where we find ourselves needing to be productive, we are feeling like that it is not, that we are being selfish, right? That idea of self-care, selfishness. So we need to be careful if it feels like play is taking away from something else, we're feeling selfish. And we need to start reframing that as self-care and just something that I was meant to do.
Yeah.
Right? So what can you put down earlier in the day to watch Netflix? It's not that Netflix is bad. It's only destructive if it keeps you from doing other things that you want to do.
Great, thank you. And we do have a couple more questions here. So do you have any suggestions for how to sleep better in this time?
Yes. Sleep can be very tricky. And I always approach this when I work with people like, hey, we're going to try different things. I'm going to make some suggestions, and some things are going to work and some things are not, because everybody's a little different. I personally really stink at visualization in my head. I'm not good at it. I need somebody to guide me through thinking of something instead of trying to do it on my own. And even then, it's still a struggle. But for some people, doing some sort of visualization of a calm, safe place that you create in your mind can be really helpful to kind of relax your brain, relax your body so that you can rest. Of course, the go-tos, and talking about, speaking of Netflix at 2:00 in the morning, we know that electronics stimulate from the light, and it kind of interferes with the melatonin production in our brain to kind of get us ready for sleep. So I typically recommend for people to turn off screens an hour before you plan to go to bed, to try and get your body into the place of where it's actually going to be ready for rest. So there's that. And once you're in bed, right, we're talking about sleep hygiene too, especially at this time, is like our bed is not used for reading, doing work, etc. It's just a place for us to sleep so that our brain is wired to rest when we get there. And then of course you can do progressive muscle relaxation where you tense your toes and then relax them, and tense your toes and relax them, and then move to your foot and to your calf and to your thigh, like progressively tensing and relaxing, consciously slowing your breathing. This is the one biological trick that we can do if we're breathing faster. So I tell people in the middle of a panic attack, or if they're having anxious moments, you're going to be breathing faster because your brain is signaling your body, I got to get ready to fight or flight. So we need more oxygen. If you can consciously slow your breathing down, your brain's going to go, oh, I don't need to be worried about anything right now. So slowing the breath, you can count backwards by 3s to try and distract your brain from thinking about things. That's often the thing that kind of keeps people up, is like, I'm planning and doing this and that kind of thing. And Phil, if you have any other suggestions, I know I went through a whole lot there, but
the only one that comes to mind for me is 2 things. One of the things we have seen post-COVID, right, when we were kind of removed from that worldly structure and we were left to what kind of structures do we put in place in our own homes. We actually saw that a lot of people's sleep patterns shifted. And we saw a lot of discord in couples originally when this happened. So one person may be, and this tends to be more structured people, we tend to wake up early. Like, I'm up at 5 and I already feel behind the ball on what I haven't gotten done. but by 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, my brain's not working anymore, right? Play people tend to wake up a little later and they're groggy in the morning, but 8, 9 o'clock at night, they are wired and they can be so productive, right? And so we actually saw in the challenge is that mostly a structured person is going to marry a play person or partner with a play person. It's usually how it happens. So when COVID hit and the expectations to be at an office at a certain time and those kind of things, we really started to see some sleep disruptions set in addition to the anxiety we're talking about. So one thing that we worked with folks on is begin to pay attention to what your natural sleep cycle is. If you don't have to be out in the worldly schedule, in a worldly structure, begin to embrace what works better for your body and finds balance in your life. And for some people that worked. So they just, again, they gave themselves permission to do self-care and sleep until 9 or 10 a.m., knowing they may work until 9 or 10 at night because it worked better for their bodies. And for some people that worked. The other that comes to mind is an exercise we call a container exercise. And it is a simple visualization where you picture whatever it is you're focusing on. If it is mortgage or Christmas or whatever those kind of what if thoughts are, you really visualize yourself in the image, putting them away in a container, sealing the container, burying it, put it wherever in a cave, wherever you want to put it, and then reminding yourself that anything that comes out, you've chosen it out because you're ready, and anything you're not ready for will stay there. And it takes practice. It's a mindfulness technique, but the more we practice it, the more we find that it actually works to reduce some of the racing thoughts and to settle our bodies.
Thank you. All right. And I think we have one last question here. It's kind of a statement, so maybe you could just give us some reflections. I am worried about the people that are not only impacted about COVID, but fires, hurricanes, political climate, etc. COVID is enough, but all of these other layers must be totally overwhelming.
Yes, and I would say one thing that we didn't really talk about today in reference to COVID is this is traumatic. Like this is the definition of trauma. Philip and I do, and a lot of people in our office do a lot of work with people who have experienced trauma. And those other things that were just mentioned, fires, hurricanes, the political, all of it, it is traumatic. And that can be really, really disorienting, and it can fuel anxiety. And then we have to go back to, okay, so how do we find our balance and what we can? And if it's so interfering, then of course, professional help, but that is a totally valid point. There are so many other things out there besides COVID.
And I would say the other thing to keep in mind, and this gets back to, for me, to the idea of having to remind myself at times of we're all born good, right? I'm good, you're good, and the world is good. Often things like hurricanes, fires, COVID created anxiety, as we talked about the whole time, lead to more destructive reactions, which can play out in political and other interpersonal relationships, can play out in parishes, they can play out in work settings, because those needs that we feel unsafe to name or we feel selfish for naming are going to be named somehow in some behavior. And we're seeing a lot of that amplified right now, right? We live in a country that's fighting over masks. That makes no sense. Really, which side do you stand on? We're fighting over fabric over our face because we need a sense of control. And so that is one of the multi-layers we're seeing where anxiety and destructive reactions are occurring together.
Yeah, that's we're struggling over control. I hadn't thought about it that way. I'm gonna think about that for a while. Well, I just wanted to say thank you once again. We went over about by 10 minutes. Thank you for everyone who was able to spend some more time with us. I'm gonna stop sharing the screen here. Yes, thank you, Philip. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, St. Paul's, for making this conversation possible. We will have a recording up on our website at some point soon. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Hope we can continue these conversations as we continue with our Sunday formation throughout the year. And you have Kristen and Philip's information if you'd like to be in touch with them. Feel free to be in touch with me as well if you have any questions. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.